The emergence of cutting-edge technology brings drastic and fast-paced change in the business world. The ability to adapt to these changes is vital for any organization's survival. Changes in technology bring on new opportunities, roles, processes, and systems that affect corporate structure and people. Human Resource Innovations and Solutions Incorporated, or HURIS, the leading consulting firm in the Philippines for comprehensive people management-driven initiatives and organizational development, has partnered with the UK-based Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, or CIPD. CIPD is the only professional body in the world that can confer individual chartered status on HR and L&D professionals, specializing in improving people management and organizational development. The partnership consolidates the expertise of HURIS in HR consulting and CIPD in the development of a human resource professional. HURIS is the sole partner of CIPD in the Philippines.
Hello everyone, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you all at your conference. I know this year, as with all of us, your conference is being held virtually, but it really is an honor for me to be able to address you all. And I know through PMAP you always have a big conference, a lot of people, you have a very vibrant HR profession in the Philippines, and I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this broad theme of agility and resilience, but particularly putting into the perspective of what this means for our profession and the context in which we are all living. And I know also that in the Philippines that you have been very challenged by the environment, by the pandemic, the economic fallout of that, and these are big, big issues for us all to wrestle with. So I'm going to move into presentation mode now because I want to share some slides with you, so hopefully this will work, and then I can take you through the story. So the first slide, I just found a picture to sort of cheer me up, because in the United Kingdom, we're now entering the winter months, so it is getting rather colder. So I'm very jealous of the tropical environment, which many of you, of course, enjoy. But we are all in a very globalized world, and particularly in this context of the pandemic, it's affecting us all. The United Kingdom, we are also facing many challenges around the lockdowns, the second wave of the pandemic, and I know you've been going through that as well, and some very, very strict lockdowns in the Philippines, but also that's beginning to get more sort of localized rather than just national lockdowns. And I think we're all in a similar place in that regard. And of course, we won't get through this until we really have probably longer term solutions like vaccines and things of that nature. But the reality also is that in the world in which we live, there are many things which are driving change, and have been for quite some time. First of all, of course, we've talked a great deal in recent years about technological change, about the growth of artificial intelligence, robotics, and all those other things, which are impacting work everywhere. They are impacting the nature of jobs and roles that we have, and of course the skills that we need. And there's a lot of debate about what that will mean. And we have a vital role in the world of HR to make sure that we are helping to use technology in businesses and organizations in ways which are good for people. And that's really important, but it is unquestionably, in the world of work, probably the biggest driver of what the future work is going to look like. And we've been talking therefore in language like that we're moving into the fourth industrial revolution. But it's not the only thing that's been driving change for a while. I mean, there's a lot of social and demographic change as well, younger generations with different expectations of work, and also a lot of geopolitical change, which I don't have to tell you about. I mean, a lot of different dialogue that's been emerging in recent years, where we had seemingly been in a world where all national boundaries and barriers were reducing, globalization was moving everywhere, and yet in recent years it's felt more like with some retrenchment on those ideas, and of course some of that coming from the United States, but indeed many other countries besides. The United Kingdom itself, as I'm sure you're aware, has been going through this Brexit discussion about breaking away from the European Union. So it's creating a different geopolitical context for us, and that, of course, is affecting many businesses and their plans for the future. And all of those things, as I said, have been driving a context for work which has been changing for a while now. And now we add on top of that, of course, the debate about what's happening with the health crisis, the pandemic, which is affecting everybody, as already touched on. But let's also not forget the environmental crisis, the whole Extinction Rebellion debate that's been going on across the world about the environment and what is happening with global warming is also a business agenda. It is affecting business as well. And it is also a societal expectation of businesses that they will make sure that they are operating responsibly to support not just the financial stakeholder, but their employees and their people, of course, their customers and suppliers, and the communities of which businesses are part, but also the environment. But perhaps the biggest challenge when you add all of these things up that's facing us immediately is the economic crisis. And I know in the Philippines you have high levels, probably record high levels of unemployment, and a lot of business uncertainty, and that's happening everywhere, and hence this debate about things like agility and innovation and resilience. And these are very, very big agendas for HR. And just to give you a few thoughts there, one of the things I've heard very, very consistently from organizations everywhere, not just in the United Kingdom, because the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, we have operations in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Europe and the United Kingdom, and we have members all over the world. So I'm hearing these stories very consistently, that the crisis has put HR at the very heart of business thinking and at the heart of the response of organizations. Because at the end of the day, this debate about the issues we're facing around the pandemic and the health crisis is at its heart a human crisis. We've had other crises in the past which might have been financially driven, like the global financial crisis, but this is very much about people. And hence, it's put HR very much at the center of the organizational response. And these are some of the issues that are being discussed. Obviously, how might we have to adapt our organizations and restructure? We're going to have to face significant redundancies. If we're closing down parts of our business, then what does that mean to our people? How do we adapt our workplaces where people are having to work from home much more, which of course is, again, part of the response in the Philippines as it is everywhere. And how do we support people when they're working remotely? How do we really therefore encourage some learning about all of this? Because many people have described the crisis as the largest experiment in home working that we've ever had. So how do we take forwards ideas like working from home as part of maybe a new world of working, which is more flexible and gives people more choice? But also other challenges that we've been facing in these times, like how do we sustain engagement with people and the connections with people? Now, I've heard many business leaders, and I would count myself amongst them, who have spent more time communicating with their people and their organization than perhaps they ever have before, because we need to make sure that we're keeping people connected when they are working remotely or when they are living and working, as we all are, in very uncertain times. And of course, also our agility, our ability to respond quickly to change, both as individuals but also organizations, is a very central agenda. And again, I'm hearing from so many businesses, people saying things like, you know what, we've done things in weeks that normally would have taken us months, if not years. So in some ways, the crisis is also driving a lot of innovation. And I do think that one of the messages behind all of this is going to be, what will we learn from this crisis that we can take forwards, so that, to use language we're using a lot, that we build back better. In other words, that we learn from the crisis, we learn more about flexible working, we learn more about resilience, we learn more about agility, and we make those things part of how we operate going forwards, so that we are benefiting from what has been a very challenging time to improve the world of work. And that is a very, very big agenda for us in our profession. I think, therefore, it is, as I said, about putting people at the heart of the business agenda, But I would also say that I think in my experience over many years working in the HR field all around the world, that HR as a profession and a practice itself hasn't always put people at the centre of the debate. And what does that mean? Well, you know, we've often thought that our job is to write lots of processes and lots of rules and maybe to control people, when actually what it means is these things. These are the central agendas for our profession in terms of engaging with our people, are things like listening to them. Do they have voice? And through what channels are we listening to them, particularly in these times of uncertainty? Are we creating cultures which empower people to give of their best and not just writing endless rules and living in a command and control world? Are we creating more inclusion, which means that people from any background can thrive at work, whatever their background, their experience, the colors of their skin, their ethnicity, their sexuality, or whatever it might be, that we give them opportunities to be successful in the world of work. And the more inclusion we create, the more we're also driving innovation, because innovation comes from differences of experience and perspective. And hence the inclusion agenda is a vital business agenda just as much as it is a societal agenda. Well-being, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, is a really, really central construct of what a good business should be doing. It should be supporting the well-being of its people. And things like shared values and fairness, that people can come to work and feel that they're treated fairly. And even things like work-life integration. How do I balance the world of work with my home life? And that has been, if we think about the paradigms of work that we've had them for a very, very long time. You know, a century or more of the idea that work, the standard hours of a working week are Monday to Friday in most countries, not every country, but certainly 5 days working weeks, that are the standard working week, and that we work, you know, 8 hours a day typically, and then we all commute to work at the same time. And you think, well, with all this technology, why is that not shifting? Why are we not providing more flexibility in where people work and how they work and the schedules of hours that they work? So work-life integration, and interestingly, it's particularly an agenda for the younger generations that are looking at the world of work and saying, why do you keep doing these things? And this crisis that we're going through now is an opportunity to rethink many of those things as well. And last but not least, I think, is this idea of compassion, the idea that we all care for each other, that we care what people think, that we are sensitive to their emotions and what they believe. And those are things that we want to feel when we come to work, because if we feel that as individuals, then we're going to be more engaged, more loyal, and it will support our well-being as well. Now, in order to do all of these things, these are not just HR issues. They are profoundly things that we need to support our managers in doing better. Because if there's another observation I would have about the world of work over many years, is that we have done a bad job generally in training our managers to be good people managers. We tend to promote people because they're the best technician, the best programmer, the best salesperson, the best engineer. So we're promoting tangible technical competence and not understanding enough and promoting and supporting the idea of these less tangible skills, which are so important to healthy working environments and getting everybody to be productive. And you may have heard this expression that people join organizations, but they typically leave managers. And the only way that we can really embed what we want to do in HR and some of the things I've already described is by training our managers to do these things better. They are the first line of support and engagement with our workforces, and we need to train them at every level. So moving the thought forwards then into talk a little bit more about some of these ideas, like well-being. I think one of the things that the crisis has taught us everywhere is that well-being as an idea must become much more central to the ways in which we build resilience in our people, resilience in our organizations, and show that we care. Now, well-being has a number of features to it. I mean, one, of course, is physical well-being, and I think many organizations in the past would have looked at that and said, well, that's kind of health and safety type things. And of course, we have a duty of care to provide physically safe working environments. But We are now seeing a much broader discussion about well-being, which includes emotional and mental health in particular. And that's, I think, a universal question which we need to address. Are we creating and supporting environments that are also good for people's mental health? Because in all the work that we've done as the CIPD on these issues, we've found increasingly over the years that the biggest reason for people not being at work, so being absent from work, particularly prolonged absences from work, or not being productive, or not staying with organisations, is because their mental health and well-being is not well supported. They're overstressed. And I'm going to touch on drivers of stress in a second. So there are all these different ideas. Financial well-being is also important, and of course it's very challenging in an economic environment of the kind that we're in to recognise that many people are facing financial hardship, and in facing financial hardship, that affects their mental health and well-being as well. So well-being is a very, very central agenda for us in the people profession, in the HR profession, and how we understand it and support our people everywhere, and so that they can be productive, they can thrive at work, and they can realise their potential. So what are some of the drivers of stress? Well, interesting, when you look at this research, it probably won't surprise you. I mean, first of all, of course, stress comes from just too much work. But it's not just the volume of work, it's have I got the resources to be productive at work? If I'm dealing with frustrations of technology, or I've not been trained properly, then I can't deal with the stresses of too much work. Or if my manager's not coaching me effectively to work effectively, then of course I'm going to see that I've got too much work, and that is a very big driver of stress. But management style is second, and it's very closely related. If I've got a manager that doesn't seem to care about me, or is not listening to me, or doesn't care that I've got too much work, or just shouts orders at me, of course that's going to affect my well-being and stress. And ultimately, over time, that will either cause me to leave the organization, it certainly will reduce my loyalty to the organization, and I will be less productive. And over time, it can affect my mental health as well. And then, of course, there's relationships at work as the third. Now, that relationships at work also, and all three of these things, incidentally, can be seen as positive drivers of resilience and well-being, as well as negative. In other words, people with too little work can also feel stressed, and too much work, of course, they can as well. Management style, of course, is both a positive driver and a negative driver. Good management and good people management, of course, is really good for my health, my well-being, and my productivity, and so on. And likewise, my relationships at work. And particularly now with the pandemic, what we've all seen is that actually the relationships that we have at work are so much part of why we work and why we work in organizations. And hence, being able to understand, as I said at the beginning, that when we're working remotely, our ability to keep connected with each other is really, really vital. And I do think that the future of work is going to focus on workplaces, not just as places where you come to work and sit at a desk or operate a machine, but also places we create those environments where people interact, can work together, can share their humanity with each other, if you will, and create really positive and supportive working cultures. So those are really, really important aspects. Well-being, understanding stress, these are all central drivers to the ideas of resilience, particularly in times of uncertainty. So let me move on then, just talk a little bit more about what this means for the profession at large. Well, first of all, I think these agendas are extending what we think about of HR. I think an awful lot of HR practice in the past has been both administrative, but also very focused on what you might call the hire to fire cycle. So my job is just to go and hire people, put them into a job which somebody else has designed, probably not from HR, progress them in some way, support performance management, then exit them at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way. And that's, of course, the very classic sort of talent management cycle of HR, and then a lot of process and often administration that sits behind all of that. But these other elements of what we do in HR are just so important as well. So learning and development. We have a fundamental role to help to develop people in the workplace. Where we have differences of skills and the needs of the job, then we should be developing people in the workplace. And particularly, of course, now with the growth and development of technology and learning and doing these digital learning and embedded learning and all these other things, we can deliver learning in the workplaces in very different ways. And again, the ability to train and develop our workforce, particularly in all the times of change that I touched on at the beginning, is an essential part of adaptability, agility, and resilience at the organizational level, as well as at the individual level. And then finally is this area of what many people will call organization design and development. And this arguably is the really strategic end of HR. This is where we're looking at things like organization operating models and all the options of different ways in which we can operate the business. It's where we're doing things like strategic workforce planning. What are the future demands of the business and where might we get people? Should we be hiring them? Should we be contracting them? Should we be partnering with people? What are the core competencies of our businesses and so on? As well as, of course, understanding things like corporate culture, which is so important to understand and to help to develop in our organizations. And if you remember that old, I think it was a Michael Porter quote, wasn't it, who said that culture can eat strategy for breakfast. And it's true, and I've experienced it. So our ability to understand things like culture and how you change it is genuinely a really important strategic agenda for our profession in every organization. And we've got to build the skills and capabilities and confidence, I think, to operate across all these domains of HR. Because I know in many parts of the world, everywhere, it doesn't matter really what part of the world, many organizations, HR is still very predominantly doing very transactional activities. And even when we have things like HR business partners, they're still being caught in this sort of cycle of more transactional and administrative activity. And we've also got to train, incidentally, our managers and leaders about what strategic HR really is. Because I've heard many leaders say things to me like, well, the trouble is with HR is it isn't strategic. And I've often said to them, well, what do you think strategic HR is? So we need to educate also business leaders on what is strategic HR, understanding things like culture, understanding the future of your workforce, understanding things like creating innovation and agility and adaptability. Those are strategic business agendas, but they are ones which we as a profession really can engage in. So that hopefully gives a sort of broader sense of where we see the profession going. But then just to touch on a couple of those ideas as well. Learning at the heart of agility. And we have a lot of work to do in the learning space, I believe. Many organizations, we've done learning in very traditional ways. We put people in classrooms and things like that. And we know from learning effectiveness models that those means of helping people to improve their skills and even to change their behaviors are only partially effective. And now with technology and in ways in which we can embed learning and so forth, we have a real opportunity to reinvent learning. And I think that learning needs to be seen as a strategic competence of any organization in these very changeable times. It is at the very heart, as I said, of agility. If having to adapt the organization, new jobs, new roles, new ways of working, then we've got to be able to train our people quickly and effectively. So you can see sort of different ways of thinking about this, but certainly moving our organization and the ways we think about learning from just about learning new skills all the way up to things like learning how to adapt, learning how to manage change, learning how to manage people, behavioral shifts and so forth are all part of a wider learning agenda. So when you add a lot of these things up, in my mind, the positioning of HR now has never been more critical. I've said for quite a number of years, actually, that I believe that all these changes, that HR has never been more critical to business. But we have to step up. And we have to understand that we've got to engage in an understanding of business strategy. What are the business priorities and needs? And how do we really work with business leaders and heads of other functions, including finance, and partner with them to understand these issues? What are the things that we then need to build to support the business strategy, which talk about things like, which I've already touched on. What is the nature of the capabilities that we need? What's the nature of the future workforce that we're going to need? And where are we going to get those people from? What kind of leadership do we need? What sort of organizational and operating models we're going to have? And what sort of culture do we need to be building from? And those are the strategic agendas for us that link very closely to business strategy and increasingly are not just driven by the business strategy, but can also inform and shape business strategy. Because if we're looking for very scarce skills around the world in a multinational organization, we may be making decisions about where to base our operations or our factories based on where we can access skills, not just because there's a consumer market or whatever that we can deal with. So these are very strategic questions. And then finally, of course, is the HR strategy. And that is not about the more strategic thing. That's how do we run HR? And I think we sometimes confuse the idea of that middle layer of strategy with HR strategy. And I've often said to HR leaders and HR people, do you think the business leaders really care about HR strategy? And the answer generally is not really. They just want to know that we're running our processes and our functions efficiently and effectively and so forth. What they really want to know and should be engaged with is much more of the strategic debate. So then I think a couple of sort of really important closing points. First of all, I know that a lot of what has driven us in our thinking of HR practice is the idea of best practice, that somewhere or somehow there was a manual that we could all take, and all we need to do is put that into our organization and everything will be fine. I think what we are seeing, and has been happening for quite a while now, is there are actually many different ways to do things. There are many different styles of organization. There are many different cultures. There are many different demands on business. So there is not, in my view, any longer a best practice. We can learn from others, of course, but we've got to understand the context of our own organization, all the way from the business strategy to the culture, to the things that people in our organization expect, and then adapt the practices. So it's about best fit. And that means we've got to step up a bit, because it does mean to say we've got to understand context and be adaptive of our policies and our practices to fit that culture, and not just assume there's one way to do these things. And we've got also to be much more driven by the outcome that we're trying to create and the evidence that is supporting that outcome. Again, a criticism that many people in business have seen of HR is we write all these processes and we write all these rules without a clear understanding of what for. What is the purpose of what we're doing? And one of my favorite examples of that is actually performance management, which is a very common core practice for HR. And we write all these processes and tell managers to do all this thing and fill in all these forms and have all these conversations without really understanding. But the purpose of all of this surely is to improve performance, and actually making sure that people are having the conversations, providing feedback immediately and in the moment and on a regular basis. Those are the ways in which you encourage performance and supporting our people more, not just having a once a year or twice a year formal performance evaluation conversation. So driving much more from the outcomes and the evidence of what those outcomes are, and therefore the actions that we're taking that are driving those outcomes, is absolutely essential in moving forwards. And that evidence comes from data. We need to understand our organizations in that perspective, but also surveys of our people, looking at scientific evidence, looking at things like behavioral science, which we haven't done enough of in the past, and embedding that thinking into the core of our practices and processes. So that's what I mean by fit for purpose people management practice. And then focus on organizational culture and governance, as I've said. This is much more of the bigger strategic agenda and understanding things like our operating models and organizational strategy. So I think I've talked about those points as well. And then to wrap up, what does it mean to us as individuals and as a profession? One of the things that I've said to HR professionals for a long time now is that I do not believe we've invested enough in ourselves as a profession. We worry a lot about developing other people in the organization, but now surely is the time when we have to invest more in ourselves to build our skills and our capabilities in this new world and all the things I've talked about, to build our confidence, because we haven't always been confident enough to challenge others in business about what is good practice or what's poor practice or whatever, and to do things like train our leaders and to make them more aware of the things that we as a profession are aware of. So we really do need to invest in our skills, and we need to see ourselves as professions. And what this slide talks to is that being a professional includes a number of things. First of all, it does include a commitment to keeping our skills current, CPD, continued professional development. It means having confidence, as I said, and committing to what we believe in, and codes of practice. And I know through PMAP and so forth, that's what institutions and HR associations also stand for. They stand for some of these ideas. They stand for an identity of a community of which we can all feel we're part. And other things like situational judgment, because HR is not like finance and accounting. Finance and accounting has lots of rules that tell you what to do. In HR, a lot of it is actually about our judgment of what is right. Yes, of course, there's laws and regulation, but a lot of what we do is about judgment and then making sure that we're doing things from a socially and ethically responsible basis. And those are things that are central to driving trust in business and trust in our people. So we've developed over several years now, with discussions with the HR profession right across the world, this profession map, which is freely available. Then we'd love to share it with you. You can access it on our websites and so forth. But it does talk, therefore, right at the heart about our purpose as a profession, which we believe is the idea to improve and champion work and working lives in its widest context, which I've touched on during the course of this talk, that we need to be led by principles, what we believe in. We need to be evidence-based. So what is the data, what's the science telling us what we should be doing, and not just reading a manual of some practice and just implementing it without evidence. And we need to be driven by the outcomes which we know are important. And then building on this idea of things like core knowledge. Do we understand about good people practices? Do we understand about digital working and analytics? But also core behaviors, ethical decision making, that we understand things like professional courage and how we influence others and how we deal with conflict. And then, of course, from that core, you can then build this idea of specialist knowledge across all the areas of which we are familiar. So hopefully in this talk, I've taken you on quite a journey from the big context in which we're operating and all the challenges and change, but to try to look at that positively also as an opportunity for positive change in the world of work and an opportunity for our profession to step up, to be the very heart of business and championing the idea of people being at the heart of business. And then moving on into this discussion about strategic HR, the scope of HR as a profession, and investing in our skills and capabilities. So let me close just by saying thank you, or salamat. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. It's always difficult when you're doing things virtually and recording them, but I hope it's been useful and helpful. And I know my colleagues and friends from Hurus also are there, and they're going to share some thoughts about how we're working together. And we would love to see opportunities and ways which we can support PMAP and support the profession of HR in your community in the Philippines, and indeed learn from you as well. Because in this world which is changing so much, we can all learn from each other. So thank you very much for listening, and good luck with what you're doing. Take care.